We're in session 5 of the Regis McKenna Oral History today, and we're going to begin with the period at Apple, Regis, where you were there after Steve left and John Sculley was now the CEO and you're still on the executive staff. What did you observe then, and how are you working in all of this change?
Well, the executive staff actually became more, I guess, more prominent at that time because people had, it seemed to me, to be more willing to speak up and to take, have their own voices heard and to actually take some leadership. Because I think each of the people on the executive staff, most of the people on the executive staff, felt that they could be the one to run Apple, and I think probably all the others would disagree with that.
Is that a natural thing, by the way? I mean, you've seen a lot of executive changes over your career. Is it the case when a CEO departs, a lot of people step up and say, well, finally my ideas are going to come to the forefront because I really know how to run this thing?
Well, I'm not an engineer, but I have a strong belief that the people who run a technical company have to have some technical bones and have to have some deep experience in that area. And that has been the problem at Apple all along. Having two different operating systems in the company, two different products that actually competed with one another, and the need for somehow to bring those together, even if you saw it as a long-term goal. Meaning the Apple II platform and the Mac platform. You just can't have those under one roof, and yet each of those groups were fighting for their autonomy. And the only people that weren't doing that, I mean, the one person that wasn't doing that was Bill Campbell, because Bill was trying to bring some rationality and sanity to the organization, and he didn't see himself at that time as capable of running it, though he probably could have. Even though he has non-technical bones, he self-educated himself, and he's a very bright guy. I think some of the problems is that the people who later on became more influential in the company were the financial people, the HR people, and things like that, and they were influencing particularly Splinder. Listened to those people more than he did, I think, the technical people. And so that became an issue later on. Now, I wasn't there when Spindler was president. I had resigned before that, largely because I felt that we had a business, and I was on the board at a level above the people who my people worked for. And it always creates a problem, I think, and I did create that problem for myself in a number of instances by going on the boards of companies, by having of who were our clients. And although I never favored our company, I mean, if I've even been on the board of a company where they fired us and I agreed with them, that sort of thing. So I didn't see myself as facing a conflict, but it's certainly perceived inside, and and the people down underneath will work against me and against our company as a result of it. So I saw a conflict, and John, I think, also felt he didn't know where my loyalties lied, and like some people, I think John felt you had to be loyal to him, and so there was always questions. In one meeting, he asked me, as I was taking notes, he would always remind me that these meetings were confidential. And Bill Campbell used to speak up and say, he's been here for 5 years. He's been doing this since the beginning of the Apple. So why are you asking that question? And but I think it was a way of saying, he's not comfortable with me in the room, and so that's why I resigned.
And you started talking about a technical company needing to be run by somebody with technical bones. Right. John Sculley was not that person. What did you observe at that point?
Well, I can. There's one story that I can probably tell, which was I felt that Apple had an opportunity to build alliances with a number of other companies. IBM had dominated the marketplace; it became the standard. But there were a lot of computer companies out there that didn't make a desktop, didn't make a laptop computer, didn't make a personal computer, but they were building minis or mainframes. And I actually made a list of them and presented them at the staff meeting at one point. And that list I have, it's in my archives at Stanford. And people like Tandem, Digital Equipment, Unisys, you could go on. There was Sun, other types of companies that were not necessarily going to compete with Apple, but would certainly like an alliance where you could have even OEM their products or just get it into the corporate world. And so I felt John ought to meet with some of these people. And I got a call one day from Gene White, who was the president of Amdahl. And that was one of the companies that I had on my list. And he said that he'd been trying to get a hold of John Scully for months, and he never returns his calls. And he said, I compete with IBM, and I can call the president of IBM, and he returns my calls. And so he was upset over it. He had been around the computer industry for a long, long time. And so I went into John, and I asked him why he wasn't doing that, and he said, well, do they know that I'm not technical? And so I mean, immediately I knew that he had the same sort of feeling that he had to have some technical background or some knowledge of the technology. And the second person that this happened to was Jimmy Triebeg at Tandem. And Jimmy had been trying to get into him. The same thing happened. And so I encouraged Jimmy to try again, and I went in and saw John, and John again said to me, does he know I'm not technical? And I said, he doesn't care. He's not here to talk about, the operating systems and the physical nature of the technology. He's here to make some sort of an agreement to get to know you and let the engineering people worry about and the marketing people worry about how to create the alliance. And so I actually went in, and Scully asked me to be in the meeting. So I was with Jimmy Triebeg. And the first thing he said to Jimmy Triebeg was, I'm not technical. And Jimmy was, I don't know if you've done an oral history with Jimmy, but he's a good old boy from the South, and he says, oh shit, neither am I. Well, he has like a PhD in engineering. I mean, he was a very, very technical guy. And but he was really, he had a much more idea of how to build relationships and to do it on a CEO to CEO basis rather than on the basis of I'm an engineer, you're an engineer. But that was something that I think haunted John. Now, I don't want to detract from John. I mean, I think he was doing the best he could. But I think that they brought him in because they saw at Pepsi, and they were the board did, and John was president of Pepsi, so they were looking for that sort of marketing aura that came, and he could bring that into the company. But what Apple really needed was somebody who could think about how to bring people together through the technology that allowed them to have one dominant architecture in the company. And so when Jobs left, I mentioned that both Bill Campbell and I had talked about this and felt that Steve would make a good head of R&D because he had that vision, and it was the Mac architecture, but he saw it as eventually taking over the company, and so that was really the nature of it, and so it just seemed to me it was getting into more and more conflict, and they already had enough people on the board who felt they should be the ones to call the shots. And I'm not going to, I don't think I got to get into mentioning all their names.
No, I think that's right, since so many of them are still around. But I would like for you to talk a bit about the board dynamic vis-a-vis Scully during this period after Steve left, and this search for leadership and for strategy and for a path forward to the company. You described one very important collision within the company with these two very different platforms that weren't reconciled. There were others too, and you said in the last session too, I think the quote was, a struggle with people on the board to get John to somehow or other have a vision for where the company should go. What did you observe in that whole period around that issue?
Well, I think that, you know, there was this sort of ambivalence about what to do, because I don't think they really had a sort of a technology strategy in terms of where are these operating systems going, and how do we implement that. It wasn't so much that they couldn't say it; they didn't know how to implement it and bring it about without creating a lot of personal conflicts in the company, and certainly some of the divisiveness in the company was created by Steve, because he would put his own group aside. You know, particularly the Mac group. He fiercely fought for keeping that group apart from the rest, and I think that just sustained itself. Now, there were things that could be done, which were done, and that is to improve improve the Mac, to improve the you know, increase the process, come out with new products that it had, you know, the next generations of memory and processors, and actually to improve the operating system, which was certainly there in patchwork form for many years. But it did bring new products to the marketplace. That got, certainly in at least the first couple years when Scully was there, it brought new revenues back into the company. And John was able to go on the road, but I think even people found that it was very difficult to ask him questions from a technology standpoint. But he also felt ambivalent about doing that, and so I think that he felt uncomfortable in that technology world. Now, I'm sure he will say he didn't, but I think other observers also would make that observation. And there are a lot of people in the company that I certainly knew well that would make that, high up people.
What was it like when John Scully's capacity to lead the company was eroding, and eventually there had to be a decision that someone else needed to come in?
Well, I think John pretty much himself became you know, overwhelmed with the job, and really was trying to look for some kind of a succession plan. And I think that they had brought Spindler back from Europe, and then Spindler was running international, and Spindler talked a really good game, and he had a good technical sense of where things were going. He could stand at a board and draw out a future strategy, and it would overwhelm you. He fell short in how you implement it, and maybe making too much headway. And I think that John, and I think it became this, again, ambivalence about the job as to whether or not he was in the right role and should he leave. And I think at times he was in and out, and he would talk to other people about succession and then pull back, and so it became really sort of unbalanced for time. And eventually, the idea was for him to, I think, go to chairman and Spindler take over as president, and that never worked well either, because Spindler complained about John, and I'm sure John's complained about Spindler. So it became, again, one of these internal battles. It's a miracle that Apple survived, because it had gone through so much of this contentious issues within the company that you can understand how it was a startup, they could be that way, but even as a startup, it was sort of a, they called themselves the pirates, and they were sort of a ragtag group of people, and kind of put together things that from their own know-how, but not in the sense of what I think had to be a long-term architecture. Now, the reason I can say these things is because I worked with other companies, and now in the same time I was working very closely with Intel, and Intel was always moving these things very methodically forward, and thought about do they stay in the memory business? Do they stay in the microprocessor? And then if they're in the microprocessor business, what's the next 3, 4, 5 generations going to look like? And how do we get to those 5 generations? And how do we sort of manage ourselves out of the memory business and really focus back into here? That was contentious in Intel as well. But you never heard about people really being upset and the whole management being in turmoil as a result of it. And so I used to say I'd spend my mornings at Intel and my afternoons at Apple, and so you could see this just constant difference in management styles and management progress. Intel had failures, lots of them, but they never let those failures overwhelm them. They basically were always pushing to create that next generation of product. Intel had many failures, but they never let those failures overwhelm them, and they never let them, crush them as a company or create the conflicts internally. And yet there were conflicts. There were lots of fights over it. I mean, I remember well, the memory people were really confused as to why are we putting all this development money into microprocessors when we're the mainstay business, and yet, by then, particularly the Japanese, but lots of companies had been into the memory business and were making actually higher quality memory and higher quality devices. And so, and that wasn't the only comparison that I had. I mean, don't forget, we had at that time, I don't know, maybe 100 clients. Yeah. And so, and I actually used that as a teaching tool, because I would say that, don't forget that not only your employees, but people like analysts and journalists go into one company and they go into your competitor, and they're making these mental comparisons about who you are and where your technology is going. And they're not all just taking down what you say and repeating it by rote. I mean, somebody like Ben Rosen, who had was a physicist, but was an analyst as well. He could analyze not only the company, but the sort of where they're going, and he would put it into some perspectives. So you began to get more and more people on the outside who could have these comparisons and values set up on various management styles and processes. So I think in that light, and of course it was a teaching tool for myself by going to these places and different ones, and seeing this happen. I mentioned that Genentech started at roughly the same time as Apple, I never saw that kind of thing there. I mean, we're dealing with PhDs in science and biochemistry and so forth coming out of UCSF. And Bob Swanson, who was I think he was a chemistry major at college, but he spent most of his time in venture capital, I think it was a company that knew their direction, had moved gradually forward. The board helped them figure out who they need someone from the financial standpoint they need, and so they methodically thought about how to create a management staff that could sustain the process and the vision of the company. Mm-hmm. I don't think Apple did that. I think it was much more ad hoc, and I think that took many years to come back, and I think that did, by the way, come back in the late 90s when Steve came back, because I think he had more experience then.
And understood it.
And I think he also, I do think that Pixar's management and style and professionalism rubbed off a lot on him.
There's one intermediate point in there that I want to get to with respect to Apple, and that's the arrival of Gil Amelio, whom you had known in another setting. Can you talk about that and your role in that?
Yeah, well, Mike followed Mike Spindler, or Gil followed Mike Spindler, and Mike had a lot of personal issues. I mean, his wife was very ill. I think Mike, they used to call him Diesel, somebody that was had no emotion, but Mike had a lot of emotional issues. I think in terms of he worried a lot, and he fretted a lot, and he was obsessed with the overwhelming power of Microsoft. Really obsessed with it. You could sit down at lunch and he'd never stop talking about Microsoft. These kinds of things, and he came to my office quite a few times to vent. And the conflicts with Scully were overwhelming to him, and these kinds of things. So he didn't have a clear view of how to manage the company. And then, as I said, I think at the time, the head of HR and the head of the finance really sort of directed him and made decisions about what the company should do. And it wasn't what. And in fact, that's where in my notebooks I show the two sort of splits that I had showed them. That one was towards IBM and one was to be a Sony, and that they had to make a decision because it meant how they staff, how they hire, how they market, everything about it. And
you felt you posed that as the strategic alternative that they could pursue. It was either more like IBM or more like Sony.
Right, and that's early on in my notebook and in the staff meetings, and I even drew a little triangle, and I put down what are the requirements to get into either one. And of course, being now this was before the internet and before a lot of those kinds of changes, but it really was sort of a visionary thing. And sure enough, I mean, when Steve came back, he was quoted in Time magazine as saying, "We want to be the digital Sony." And fortunately, the internet solved a lot of the issues of getting into and modern networks got into solved the problem of how they get into the enterprise, which they struggled with. But Gil Amelio came on. He was the president of National Semiconductor, and I didn't know him so much in terms of working with him as management. I knew him because of the SIA days, Semiconductor Industry Association. He was at, I believe, Rockwell in L.A. And I think he ran their semiconductor operations. And Noyce and he and I were the marketing committee for SIA at the time. And so Bob would fly down in his jet, which he liked to do, and so I would go with Bob, and we'd have our meetings down there. And so I got actually to know Bob better, and so when Gil came on the board of Apple, I thought it was probably a good move because he'd been around, he'd been at Rockwell, he'd been at National, and I didn't spend any time doing anything for National while he was president. I did meet with him a few times, I had lunch with him a few times, but that was usually over some SIA issue, not about the company. When he came in, though, it was clear that Apple was declining. Not only revenues, but he brought in with him some people that I again won't get into, but those people had no sense of. I knew those people for years, and I knew they brought in some people from IBM Systems and so forth who. And not only that, but also people out of the semiconductor industry that just didn't have the idea what the personal computer business was about, or from out of the computer industry. And so they all wanted to be miniature Steve Jobs. I mean, getting up at their conferences with black turtlenecks on and jeans, and I mean, and these are middle age. This is like having the Hells Angels dress up in a tuxedo. I mean, it was that contrasting to see them there, trying to imitate Steve. And it wasn't this was not an issue that could be solved with superficial kinds of presentations. It was one in which I think they really fumbled on what to do and how to meet the marketplace. Now, again, on the other side, the Wintel platform was just running rampant, and it was controlling the personal computer industry at that time, and the clones. And so they were up against that, and there was no sort of long-term strategy as how to solve it. So we were pretty well into the consulting at that time, and I went in and made an appointment with Gil, and I went in and made a presentation to him on how to fix Apple and what they should go about doing. And
had he requested that, or was this something?
No, he didn't request it. I went in and just, because a lot of people from Apple and from other places were having lunch with me and talking to me and saying, something ought to happen at Apple because it's dying, and it's just there's just no pizzazz there in the company anymore in terms of products, and the products like they're pen-based systems and voice-based systems, all these were failing. Newton and things like that had failed.
You were talking about how people had come to you and were saying there's a kind of lack of focus here and it needs to be addressed.
I think at Apple, once Steve left, there were, I even had, people call and want to have lunch with me who said they felt that they could come in and run Apple. I had lots of emails from people, wanting an introduction so they could come in. But it seemed that two things were happening here. One is the board was not close enough to the management to know what was going on, or they were willing to let it ride and see if somebody could solve it, because the board wasn't acting either. But I put together a presentation that.
Let me just, before you talk about the presentation, is that what you said? Well, first of all, I just think it's very interesting that this is an important dimension of your career in Silicon Valley. You were kind of the father confessor in many ways to people who would come to you and seek advice and give advice, and you were the glue that held a lot of these relationships together. How did you handle that when people would come to you, very important issues like the future of Apple, and they were making these suggestions and possibly even believing you might take this to the board and give them some advice along those lines? How did you handle that?
Well, depending upon who it was, but I continued my lunches and dinners with Bill Campbell over the years, and certainly he and I would always talk about what was going on there, because he too was getting that same feedback. Certainly Spindler remained in the area, and he would call us and we'd have lunch and so forth. And
would he be seeking that same kind of insight?
No, he was basically just venting. In fact, I think there was a point at which Bill and I said, we both had lunch with him, I think, and it was all about Microsoft, and so we kind of left saying, I think we're not going to have any more lunches. But I don't mean that in bad sense about Mike. I actually sort of felt sorry for him, because he had a lot of, as I said, family issues and illnesses and that sort of thing that he was constantly pulling on him from his family side.
Yeah.
And he at least had some strategic insight as to where Apple would go. I don't know what Amelio was trying to do, but I don't think he had the vision of being a digital Sony or those kinds of things, nor do I think that a guy who had spent his whole life and career in chips and building semiconductors, had the capability of doing that. So I think that when so many different people were sort of calling me or feeding me emails or whatever, that
and some whose opinion you clearly respected.
yeah, there was pretty much it would be a conversation of almost anybody you'd meet in the Valley at that time. Is what about what's happening at Apple? And because I had a career at Apple, people would ask me, and so I had hired a group of consultants. I was doing some Gemini, the consulting group. We also had an alliance with them, and so some people from Gemini came to me and said, you know, something ought to be done at Apple, and so we sat down together and came up with, well, what could they do? And we spent an afternoon on the board doing a session on it, just for our own I guess, mental health, and but out of that, I wrote a sort of plan as to what they could do in terms of I think 10 or 15 different steps to take, and I know that one of the first ones was that they I strongly feel that the best positioning tool that any company in the technology business has is being profitable. If you're profitable, then I think the world will look at you and say, okay, you're doing something well and right. But if you're not profitable, they want to know what's wrong, and and the CEO gets put on the spot. And it also becomes very vulnerable when you're losing money. It's when your competitors start hiring your people because they figure you're vulnerable. It's when your competitors start going after your customers because they know there's probably not going to be a long-term presence in the market. So services begin to fade. So profitability, I know, was one of the things I wanted to go to, is you got to turn Apple profitable, however you can make that happen. And that would be to probably cut people, maybe even cut product lines, and to do but the idea was to do a complete evaluation of your assets and liabilities and how to go through that first. Number 15 I remember well because I said, bring Steve Jobs back into the company and give him a strategic position of helping to straighten out the company and set its vision. I'm sure he thought about, I don't think he thought about that, but that was number 15.
Did you remember how he reacted to that?
He didn't react much at all to the whole thing.
You took him through point by point, all 15
I gave him
points.
a presentation, probably about 2 hours in his office, point by point, and it involved, you know, building some alliances with other companies out there and learning from them, and that sort of thing. But I think he also relied, I think, heavily on his staff, and there was a real arrogance, I think, among his management. Even I learned later that was also, he had developed that at National, that we know how to do this thing and nobody else does. And they sort of were, go away, go away, go away.
So the arrogance was, thank you very much for your opinion, but we know
Yeah.
how to do this.
Yeah.
Huh.
If not in those exact words. So it seemed rather hopeless. Now, it turns out that just following that downstream, Amelio did instigate buying Next, because but he had talked to several other, including Gassay's company, B. He had a company that was developing an operating system, and I know that Gassay was hoping to sell that operating system to Apple, you know, it turns out that people had been encouraging him to get out of the hardware business and to get into the software business, and this had an opportunity to do that. So that deal was cut, if I go into my conversations with Steve, they said, thank you for the software, but we don't need your help. And that was the exact words. Steve went over there and spent, I think, a morning with him, and I have a full page of notes on my meeting with Steve on that, and
I think I remember you talking about this and maybe even quoting your notes where Steve contacted you after he first encountered Apple and said, it's a pretty weird place.
Yeah, he said that there are more PR people than engineers, and I believe that. This is again where the reflection is more important than the reality, and that as long as the marketplace thought we were doing well, we're doing well, and that's just hubris. I mean, the media doesn't create who you are; it reflects who you are, and so that was certainly a living lesson right there.
What were you able to tell him at that point about what you had observed and what you felt needed to happen?
Well, he knew about I had talked to him about what we had presented to Gil.
You did. You took him through the 15.
No, I
points,
didn't. I didn't. I just this was at that time that was a phone call with him in which he called me and told me about the meeting that he had there, and that he said they don't appear to want help. They didn't offer him a job. They didn't offer him to be a consultant. They didn't offer any position for him at all. And so I think he went out very sad because I think he felt that Steve always felt that if he got in, he could take control. And I think he was just so far better equipped to do that in 1997 or 98 than he was in 1985, and also he had gone through the next system and putting that together and the importance of software, and then from Pixar the professionalism of the staff there and the management and how they did. I think all these were lessons that he learned, and great observer, he would absorb everything from the outside world. And I think he synthesized that into a new vision for Apple. But I think that was in the back of his head. In the meantime was, how does he do it? And there were conversations. I think Larry Ellison of Oracle said he had talked to him about how to do a buyout of some kind, or to buy the company, raise enough private capital to do that. I don't think Steve wanted to do that. I'm not sure why, but I don't think he wanted to do that. I think that would have left, again, sort of an overseeing board that he didn't control. And I think he wasn't going to let a board get in control of the company anymore if that happened. So he had that meeting, and things continued to deteriorate at Apple. And then about 3 or 4 months later, I got a call from him, and his first words were, "What do you think about my new board?" And so I knew that he had done this because Bill Campbell went on the board, which I think was his long-term consulting friend and actually neighbor, and Bill would be blunt and honest, but he would never do anything to hurt Steve or Apple. He was always, everything Bill did was in good spirits and in the pursuit of truth for Apple, and so I think that was an absolutely super addition, and he actually asked the other people on the board to resign, and he didn't say anything negative. He didn't say, "Gee, I just don't want you around anymore." He basically told them he wants to start fresh. That's what he told them, and so he wanted to start his own, start Apple again, and I think that's something that would make a real interesting sort of conversation. Is how did someone who had no interest in the company in terms of equity, he didn't buy it for cash, he sold something to them. And essentially, between that first conversation that I recorded and the second one, he came in and actually created a new board and had a new vision for the products. And that period, whatever he did and however he did it, no one's surprised he did it, It's just that I think that was sort of a that was a miracle to have that, to lack the control over what was happening, but to make it happen.
Were you surprised that he was able to do that?
Was I surprised, Steve? No, no. I didn't. I wasn't certainly certain at all that it would be successful. But the fact that he was able to take it over and do that, and because Steve could, he could talk the arm off of a chair. He was quite persuasive, and he did always have a good vision for where the company was going. But I don't think anybody quite understood what he had in terms of absorbed over the last 8 years to actually begin applying that. And in fact, I have another long conversation, and these are phone conversations, in which he told me that what he did in terms of cutting the products lines back, of focusing on just a few areas within the company, the laptop, and it was in the iPod, and which would become the iPhone later on.
Yes.
And cutting out all of these, apparently under Amelio, they had typical of something like at IBM, where they had a lot of teams doing the same thing and competing with one another with projects. And he said, I don't want my teams competing, a la Apple II and Mac. He wants to try everybody working on the same page, working together, and having a vision for where they're going. And that just settled a lot of problems within the company, the people. That's why he had such retention among his people, because now they came back and had something, had a vision in front of them, and could follow that. He said there were a lot of good people at Apple, and he was surprised that they stayed. And it was sort of heartwarming, to say the least. That he said that the people, when he asked them why they stayed, they said because we bleed in 6 colors, and that was the logo of the original Apple, and so they had that within them that he had instilled early on, and I think they wanted to continue along that path.
And even though you didn't have the same kind of relationship at Apple after that, you and he stayed in close touch, didn't you, in all those intervening years?
Yeah, we had lunch from time to time at Next. I went to his product launch in San Francisco with him. I wanted to stay friends with him, and I think he wanted to stay friends with me. And he would call me for stuff along the lines, and we'd have conversations. I mean, I had conversations with him about his product launch on the next product, and he knew it was going to be delayed, and we had a conversation about how long do we have that delay, and do you think, what would happen if we delayed it beyond certain points, and those kind of things. And so I remember having that conversation with him. But it was just to keep the conversation going, and we did over long periods of time. When he went back to Apple, I had lunch with him over there a few times.
In the cafeteria?
Yeah, in the cafeteria. And learned all about how he got trained the sushi people in Japan before he opened the sushi bar at Apple. To get back to Steve, everything he did, to try to get it perfect. So he sent the whole team of chefs over to Japan for training and how to do sushi before he opened the bar, and those kind of things.
A very typical Steve Jobs story.
Yeah, very typical Steve Jobs, and so he applied that to everything in the company, and he gave it a vision. But it did take. People think that he went back and Apple sort of jumped into the spotlight, but it didn't. It took about 2 years after he got there, and so he was worried about again, one of the conversations is we have a lot of great products ready to launch if people will give us time. he told me about they're going to go online, and that they're going to ship products within 48 hours, and that sort of thing. And so the plans were evolving, and we would talk about that. I wasn't in a position where I had any consulting advice to give him. I'd ask questions, he'd answer, we'd go back and forth. So it was more like, two friends rather than, and I wanted it on that basis. I even said that to him. At one point he did ask me to come back, and I said no. And I basically said I'd rather be friends, and that's how we kept it. In fact, he asked me to do that twice. And I, whenever I helped him on the iPhone, and again, I said no.
Talk a little bit about your involvement there too, Regis, with talking to Steve directly about the lead up to the iPhone.
Well, I had one, and so I would buy their products at that point, and I didn't have a problem with my phone, but if you did cover up that one part of the phone when you held it, it would shut out. It would shut.
This was the issue with the antenna around the outside of the phone.
Yeah, I call it antenna gate.
Yes.
And I got a call from Steve, and he was actually in Hawaii with his family, and he said he was going to fly back, and could I meet him on, I think, Monday or something like that, and I said sure, and so he basically called together a meeting of it was some of the people from Chiat who was still working on his account. He had his marketing people there, and some of the engineering people, and we had a meeting in his conference room, and his son Reed was there. He brought his son Reed. He wanted him to observe it, and by and large, I think people were saying. I asked for the data. I wanted to see what the data had to say, because I knew Apple, they had collected a huge amount of data from all the users and all the people that had complained, all those who wanted who returns on the phone and so forth. And compared to the phone before it, the iPhone before it, it actually was the one before was actually worse than that phone. And so it was really a relatively minor issue to the consumers that were buying it, from my standpoint. And I first advised them to just let it go. I said it'll fade away. Fix it. And he didn't want to do that. He said no, we've got to address it. And I said, but there's only really a relatively few people that are making noise about it. And you may be making a bigger issue. And we talked about that in the meeting. But most of the other people were telling him to come out and apologize. And I said, they really wanted him to put his tail between his legs and go out there and be very humble and so forth. And I said, don't do that. I don't think that's you. I don't think that's what you should do, and I don't think the data calls for that, quite frankly. I think you do tell people that technology products are never born perfect, that they will improve, and they're constantly being improved. And he used that line, actually, in his when he talked. And basically he said, we'll address the problem. They gave you a little band that you put around it. And then on the next generation, as soon as we can, we will change it. We'll get. They had all their antenna people working on it, and it solved the problem and it passed. But what happened was, of course, once he went out and said these things, they didn't lose confidence in the company by saying, "Oh, here's a big failure," because there were people. What's his name, the president of Microsoft at the time, said this was going to be a failure, this product, and it wasn't. It still continued to sell, and then the next generation even sold more. So it had an opportunity to be a hiccup, but it wasn't. I didn't think it would be a long-term disaster.
I think we've finished with the Apple section of this now. Are there any final thoughts that you want to add?
Only that I had an opportunity to meet with Tim Cook after. Tim invited me over to lunch, and and I met with him and his executive staff, and we talked. And when Tim had just come on board, and he told me that Steve said, "Don't ever ask yourself what would Steve Jobs do." And that was Steve, and I think that was really wonderful, and it gave a great deal of confidence in Tim. Tim's background was superb. I always felt that he really made Apple because his logistics knowledge and implementation of the logistics systems. In the 80s, Apple made everything. They used to even want to make their own power supplies and things like that. And Tim basically got rid of the manufacturing and sourced everything, all the components. But they were the quality control on everything that went into the design. On the design, they controlled the design, they controlled the architecture, they controlled the quality on all the parts, and that was Tim. Plus, then being able to supply the stores and customers, from birth to death of the product. They managed every little aspect of it. Let's say from birth to shipment. And that was Tim's, again, very much like Steve, in his precision and his knowledge and his real refinement of quality. And I think people overlook that entirely, because he certainly doesn't make the presentations the way Steve did, and he doesn't try to, but he brings more people in to do it. And sitting in a couple of his staff meetings since then, he looks to his team, and he delegates, and he questions, and he takes all kinds of inputs, but he's as precise as Steve was, I think, in execution. So I think he's just been super, and I think he at the time we had a conversation. I told him, I just said, you're gonna do great, and he said, I hope so. So it sounded a little bit like, I don't know yet, and he didn't, because the world was really beating him up quite a bit, and all he could do is put his head down and move forward and keep showing them, and he did. And I think he's added more value in the company than any single leader that they've had, including Steve. And so I think that particular succession was Steve's choice, and a good one.
Do you, you've seen the birth and the growth of such a large number of iconic companies in Silicon Valley who've been able to sustain that excellence over 40 years or more. Do you think, do you see in the culture and the DNA of Apple a company that you think will be able to do that in the same way Intel and others have? Are they singular as a company in that way, do you think?
Well, I think that they are. I think that they've built a deep research operation within their organization, and that unlike other research organizations that I had experience with, like Xerox and Xerox PARC, and even Varian and HP, they have a sustaining R&D flow that goes up into productization, and in a wide range of areas. And I know that just not because I know something inside Apple, but I know a number of the vendors. And I know companies who want to be vendors who have gone through the process. And but it's in multiple areas, and it's across all their spectrums of everything from from processor development. If you look at their processor development, their new watch has 6 billion transistors on the processor, and that was their design. So they've got some expertise in there that goes well beyond, making a phone. It's not a phone anymore. It's a medical device. It's a communication device. It's your history. It's all sorts of things. But to be able to build the electronics in it and to design those electronics from within Apple and control that intellectual property, they're making processors that compete with Intel.
So you believe the prognosis is good?
Yeah, I mean, Steve once asked me, "Will we ever be bigger than Intel?" And I thought they would be.
Yeah.
I mean, because they were building an end product where Intel was building a component. And I said, usually the component companies are not as big as the end systems companies.
Yeah.
And it's just because of the nature of the products.
All right, now we're going to move into a session on the growth and change of Regis McKenna Incorporated as a business. And this section will roughly talk about the time period from 1980 to 1995. So during this period, in addition to all the work we've talked about with specific companies, Regis, you were growing a major strategy consultancy. I mean, marketing was at the center of it, but you were really, as we've already discussed, as much about business strategy and macro views as you were about specific marketing strategies for specific clients. And so I want to ask you, first of all, what was your approach to building a creative organization like this and being able to convert your overarching vision of these big trends and where things were going, and then actually build it into an organization that could actually make real work happen on the ground?
Well, again, I started my company in 1970. I left National, and remember I had worked for 2 semiconductor startups, General Microelectronics, that were the source of MOS technology, which was the basic process technology and design technology that later on allowed Intel and other companies to get, develop their processors and memories. They were a bipolar company. Intel, for example, was a bipolar company before that, that technology, and they got a lot of that from people that left GME, the GME Philco combination, and went to Intel. So I sort of lived through that follow-on activity, and GME failed for a number of reasons. One was that it was actually almost too early into the market. The technology wasn't yet mature enough to be able to produce LSI technology, or they would then call LSI or VLSI technology, very large-scale integrated technology, because the processes couldn't handle multiple transistors at once and do it in a uniform manner and with a highly reliable outcome. So yields were terrible, and so the company failed largely based on that. But still in all, they initiated something that became a model, I think, later on for other companies. National was a very buttoned-up company, very disciplined, and again, thanks to Don Valentine, who was my boss, and Charlie Spork, who gave me a lot of latitude, they had me on the road a lot, and so I was able to learn from things like distribution, the importance of field organizations, how Europe was developed. I worked quite a bit on European development, meeting with new representatives in Europe and so forth, and helping them set up their programs and doing things locally. So it was really thinking outside in versus inside out. So I was armed with something, and at that time when I started, my first, I think 9 or 10 clients were all semiconductor-based clients. So I offered them something that was some experience, and indeed that was what we talked a lot about. And a lot of them at the time wanted to emulate National in some way, because it had grown very fast and was a global company. And so I had participated in that, and National was still a small group of management. You know, I knew all the key managers, I knew all the key engineers, and was able to spend personal time with all of them. So I was able to observe, and so I could offer, at least, if not, here's how they did it, some reflection on that. And so the first part was really sort of when I left was to just be independent and not find myself doing the same thing over and over and over again, but build some value in it. And I just, it was survival. So you took on business that was there, although it turned out that my experience led to that, having companies that were in the same vein as the semiconductor. And there wasn't much that was going on in the world of new companies and new technologies. It wasn't semiconductor in some way, or a reference into the semiconductor business. You know, as the 80s began, we began getting into more systems type products. And again, the experience, one of my first clients in 1971 was Intel. And Intel was a chip company that became a systems company. And having worked with them through particularly the development of the microprocessor, which you know, it was just a product that was just wonderful to work on because it was different than all the other semiconductors. It was programmable. It was infinitely adaptable, and it really solved key problems for companies in terms of products to market, increased functionality, lower cost of getting development done, and so forth. But it wasn't the standard way of getting end products designed, and so you had to change the way people thought in the marketplace to get that done. That took about 10 years of work, of constantly meetings, discussions, developing presentations to the end market, and sort of culminating in the crush group that pulled the whole company organization together into one small team that had to look at all of those things as to how we could bring all of those resources and change them, if necessary, to bear against a major competitor who had a better product at the time, or at least it was perceived to be a better product. And how do you overcome that? How do you and that experience alone, I think, helped in major ways in terms of my understanding where the future lied. And within my company, we started out doing things that companies needed because Silicon Valley had an anti-consultant attitude. They were engineers. They could solve the problems themselves that needed solving. There was sort of marketing was sales. It was distribution and sales. It wasn't sitting back and saying, how do we plan the next products? How do we look at competitive nature, the competitive business? On the other hand, from Valentine, he set each of the people in the product in his team had to follow a competitor. I had Motorola, and you had to know when you went into the meetings with him, you had to be able to report on what are they doing, what products are they coming out with, you know, what's new at Motorola, what's going on, what new products are coming out, those kinds of things. And so the competitive analysis became sort of part of the knowledge base that I learned, and that was valuable. Again, in any business that you went into, is what's going on in the people out there who were competitors or seemed like they might be competitors. So let's take Apple, which came in. There were a lot of potential competitors. IBM wasn't in the business yet. Texas Instruments wasn't in the business yet. HP wasn't in the business. The Japanese weren't in the business when Apple came out. So there were all these potential competitors that we had to look at in terms of how that market would evolve. And even Genentech was the kind of company where if you looked at the marketplace and analyzed it, their first product was called somatostatin. And that was a hormone that was a precursor to the insulin molecule. And Lilly owned 90% of the insulin market. It was derived from extraction of the insulin from pigs and cows. pancreas. And it was a long process, expensive process. And so understanding that and what to do with that was that Genentech's first target wasn't the marketplace, it wasn't the consumer, it was a few big pharmaceutical companies. And so and I can show you the articles. So what I did was I got 2 articles written, one in Wall Street Journal and one in Business Week. And they were explaining, basically it was the launch of somatostatin and where that would lead to insulin. And it actually went into their strategy, which is kind of interesting. I was just reading it again before this meeting, in which both Herb Boyer and Bob Swanson talk about taking them into not only the pharmaceutical market, but the industrial marketplace. And I remember sitting down with Bob and going through plans as to, what do you mean by industrial, and where would we go there? Well, a lot of fermentation goes on in the industry, and that's basically a recombinant process. So any of the fermentation industries could also maybe use this technology, and they weren't going to give that up at the time because they felt that that might be a possibility. So it was a company that that follows sort of a chart that I made very early on, if I could find it. It was that marketing is like going to the moon, and that you don't aim at the moon, you aim at where the moon's going to be. Because if you go there, you'll go out into Neverland. And so I have a chart, a picture of that was actually sent to me by Kodak, the vice president of marketing at Kodak, because I made a talk there. And we got to be friends and got involved, and he sent this to me and said, here's how I interpreted your conversation. And he used it at Kodak, is that you can't target your markets, one to one. You have to cancel them in terms of, so rocket ship is constantly adjusting to the environment as it moves. And so as things happen, it has to keep it on a trajectory that is a parabol rather than a straight line. And then it lands on the moon later on, from where it headed. So that came out of all of that sort of conversation. As these companies start, they put together these plans, they have some core ideas, and as they go, part of my job, and I felt our job long term, would be to help shape that curve. Is where should you be heading? And that doesn't mean we know what you're doing. It means that we can look at what you're doing and keep adjusting with respect to competitive environment, to the technology environment, to the shape of the way people are looking at you through this prism of their current world. And that just evolved over time so that by the early 80s it was much more in a formula for me. And I couldn't find them, but I started creating these circular charts for Apple, and each segment would have what's going on in that personal computer marketplace. And every quarter it was changed. There were different competitors, there were different influences from the software world, there were just different economic, political, social, and technological changes that were going on. And I would sort of put them into these. So I have a series of like 3 years of those charts that I had made for Apple on a regular basis to keep looking at the environment, see what's changing and how you respond to it. That's that arc that you keep trying to adjust to get where you're going.
And this process helped you stay ahead of what was a very fast-changing landscape at that point.
You have to have it, because you can't really predict the future. This is where, again, I wrote the book Real Time later on, was because the marketplace is in real time. And you can't really predict that. You have to actually live it and then adjust on basically with a lot of feedback. And you gain that feedback in the near term, not in the long term. So that today the feedback loop on knowledge that goes into the computer systems, and it's become both a plus and a minus to many people, is literally instantaneous. It's less than a few seconds. So real time was a military term. It was that you can't make a decision faster than a bullet or a rocket, but you built in systems that are constantly adjusting, or that can do the analysis for you, and it adjusts the plane or the rocket or the ship in real time. You don't. That's all programmed ahead of time. That's not done in that instant. So, or it's done in that instant and not in terms of long term. So that's something that it takes, which was I learned from a professor at Stanford that I recall his name later on, but he wrote a book called Inside the Black Box, and he was an economist at Stanford, and he said, technology is a hands-on business. You learn by doing. And so that became a really critical point, I think, in my career and in my companies, is you learn by doing. Get people's hands on. Even young people come in, get them out and start having them work on things. And I just talked to a young fellow. I hired him when he was, in his early 20s, right out of school. And he was talking to me about, you've thrown me in with people like Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore. The first week I was there, and I was terrified. He said, but today I'm so grateful you did. He said, because that was a great learning experience for me.
That leads me to another question, which is, what kind of person did you look for that you knew could thrive in this kind of environment?
Well, we tried to create a team, this was again something that I learned early, was because we were in a technical environment, we had to have people that understood the technology. And so one of the things was we hired people who were engineers, and by and large, those people, to get into what we were as a marketing business or a communications business, they were largely technical journalists. So I hired people from electronics magazines. I hired electronics, which was the key, I guess it was the best known at the time. Excuse me. I hired their top technical writer, George Sedaris, and George goes through a lot of technical articles for people in all the Intel and most of the technical companies out there. But he would sit in the meetings, and there was other people like that who were very knowledgeable and had ability to work with. And then we'd have creative people who actually had creative backgrounds. They were either writers or technology or creative directors from ad agencies, and that was the hardest people to hire. And then people who were sort of product marketing people who had one foot in each, so they could balance it out. And that became small groups and teams who worked on clients. A little bit of everything, so that you could, you couldn't have crazy creative people going off crazy and doing things that didn't fit the goal or the nature of the technology itself. And so, I think one of the biggest things when I was an ad manager inside National was getting an ad agency that could write an ad that made sense, because they mostly were coming out of the consumer world, and they would write nice fluffy words, but it didn't say anything to the engineers. And so the ability to change that, we did. I mean, I think this is the kind of ad, for example, we did at Intel, which was very early in the microprocessor, which was how to buy one. And now that's called microcomputer. You would think that was a personal computer. That's the chip. That's the microprocessor. That's what they were called then, microcomputers. And then give examples. Okay, so we then would write these examples. And so this was both, and this is from the meeting that at Intel, talking about these various applications. I went out and got salesmen to give me names of people that I could use in here. This allowed you to write in for a booklet that would give you the detailed information. So, and I did a very similar one at Apple, which was how do you buy a personal computer? And it was the early stages of trying to educate the marketplace, even though you could say it's an ad agency, but most ad agencies wouldn't think in terms of educating the marketplace. They'd think about trying to sell the ad.
Yeah.
Or sell a product in the ad.
Well, another thing I like about that is the whimsy. You've got a rooster in the middle of a page about a
chicken or egg,
a chip, and you've got a cheeseburger in the middle of the the page about applications.
Right. And this was a guy, the art director was Jerry Lenhart, and Jerry came from one of the big ad agencies in San Francisco. Was a very creative guy, and you know, he called the chips bugs, and he didn't know anything about the chips, but the ability to give him the content and then him to use his imagination to how to illustrate it, and he was very good at that. He was super.
Was there a moment for you personally? You talked about a minute ago this formula that you came up with. It was a combination of competitive analysis and understanding the technology, and then looking at all the other social, political, market forces that were shaping demand. Was there an aha moment for you at some point where you said to yourself, now I have it. Now I really understand. This is a kind of generalizable approach that I can begin to work with many clients on?
No.
No.
You just work, and it's developing. It's you know, you learn by doing, and you apply in the same way. So you're hands-on, and it's basically in the process of working with the product marketing managers and the entrepreneurs. And again, I was fortunate, and I was here so early doing this sort of thing, that I was working largely with entrepreneurs and the first layers of management that came in. And they were always receptive to, I always found them very receptive, and good feedback. I mean, they did know what they wanted, and they knew their businesses well, most of them. And so as a result, there was sort of we became part of their team. And that was the way we like to work. And I don't know of too many ongoing clients where we didn't have between 5 and 10 people working every day within the client itself as a part of the marketing team.
You mentioned that one of the virtues of that ad campaign or ad campaigns like that was educating a market on these new products that were coming at them that would be
Right.
game changers. Did you find that you had to educate clients at the same time about that approach? The reason I ask is that I've always been very struck by how you've gently pushed back against the notion that it was just an ad, or it was just PR, or it was just an article, and that you were able to flip the mindset of a client up to a higher level and
Right.
say, no, there's really more to it than that.
Yeah, well, largely I think it's because of understanding the businesses that we were going into, and then being here in the Valley, is that there is a certain tendency to, while being very technically oriented as a community, they are in love with the big ad agencies and somehow the big ad campaigns that go on television and being on television in some way. So that, I mean, all the companies that I know of in the Valley, at least at one time or another, experimented with television commercials, even though they were their marketplace when they were a dozen companies, right? I mean, I know of semiconductor equipment companies that did television ads. And I remember asking the CEO, why? I mean, you sell to the semiconductor companies, and there's 100 of them in the world. I mean, something like that. You can go and call on them. Why do advertising on national television? Well, they're never quite sure, but somebody sold them on it, and it made their ego, even that it certainly hit their budget big. There's this love affair with glamorous Hollywood. It's still here in many instances, and a lot of the people that, and that was always also a sort of a fear against us that I had, was that, and they would eventually do it, was they would go and hire a big ad agency, and because it just has that glamour to it. It's why people hire McKinsey, because McKinsey has a reputation, not because they necessarily have any specific knowledge in your area. And that still goes on. I can honestly say I met a year or two ago with the top management at Mazda, who came over here to listen to my pitch, and They basically were telling me they couldn't do what I was telling them to do because some consultant out of Harvard, who was now with McKinsey, had told them to go this other way, and it was clearly not leading them to be the Toyota of the future. And so there's this sort of belief out there that there's some magic answer. There's some white knight that's going to come in. It's why they brought in Scully. It's why people, go on television. It's why they do these. When in effect, it's hard work. It's putting your nose to the grindstone. It's knowing your market. It's spending time in your market. It's listening to people. It's all sort of the practical kinds of things that make companies successful. And I think, as they get bigger, they get more abstract from it. And as they're really small, they believe it. And so it's your biggest competitors are these intangible things for us. I saw, not the tangible items. I wasn't worried about, because we certainly outgrew anybody in the area, and we were making more money than anybody in the area. But so I never really worried about that, because people just weren't going to put the commitment. I mean, I had a full library staff, research staff. We hired a librarian to run that, and so you could come in and give her a project. She ended up working for AT&T's information system. So I mean, these people were good people, and they could do research, and so you had to put those kinds of organizations in if you wanted to move into a more value-added kind of position in a business. But it's not only the vision, not only understanding the marketplace. It's also this. I guess Andy Grove said, you have to be paranoid all the time, but the paranoia for me wasn't some company. It was sort of the ideas of people had about what they think marketing is.
And you also were unique, and I now want to get into something we were talking about offline, which is this unique perspective you had to make comparisons between market segments, comparisons between companies and products or ideas for developing products. Can we just go through some of those?
Sure.
That illustrate the unique perspective that you had?
Yeah. Some of the early ones was Genentech and a company called Cetus. Cetus was a biotech company located in Emeryville. I think they're actually still there. But they saw themselves as a competitor to Genentech, and they couldn't quite understand why Genentech got sort of into the public's eye much faster, and because Genentech actually grew faster and did everything better than them. And I also was working for Cetus, who always claimed to be in a different market perspective. They weren't even doing the same things at Genentech, but they were in the biotech business. But as I got involved, and I was very involved, particularly with their CEO and their management team, they would their product plans were 10 and 20 years out. And I told them they had to actually show timelines to productization, that the marketplace just wouldn't pay much attention to them unless they could set up a timeline and say, this is where we're headed. These are the kinds of specific things we're going to develop. They were talking about biomass and converting biomass into tangible products, but that was a 10, 20-year project. Those kinds of long-term things. Genentech had a goal. It came out with, the first product was somatostatin, the second one was insulin. They had very specific targets that people could identify with, and analysts could say, okay, here's the market for that product. You're going after that market. I understand it. So the analyst world would look at biomass and say, what's the market for it? How big is it? No one could measure that. And so, and I worked with those basically side by side. And I remember putting together presentations for the CEO going back to an analyst meeting in New York, and I put it around productization and so forth, and I kind of forced them into these categories. And then when I got back there, he got off on a tangent and started talking about 20-year projects. And he spent the whole meeting talking about that. And of course, he came out of there, and there was no response. I mean, and so I then walked away from them because I couldn't get any further with them unless I could get them to do that as a productization. So it wasn't the marketing that failed; it was the development line and the management's ability to put this stuff into tangible market productization, and that just never happened there, or it didn't happen there for a long, long time. There was Intel, and actually there were two other companies that I worked with after that, or at least got to know well after that. Intel, the Crush program at the end of the 70s and the early 80s, that Andy Grove had formed a team that we called the Crush Project, which was to get people that represented the areas of the company and to figure out how to take the Intel's product line and turn it into a viable competitor for the Motorola's 68,000. 68,000 was a 32-bit processor, and Intel's processor was sort of it was sort of an in-between. It was called the 8088. It wasn't the 8080, and it wasn't the 8086. It was the 8088, and that's where they were. They were slow, or they were not out with a competitive product. So the idea was, how do we then get that? And one of the key companies that we were trying to reach, although we identified lots of companies and all by market segment, we looked at telecommunications, industrial, computer, and so forth. We looked at all those segments. Who are the top companies? Who are the ones that we can make these presentations to? And the key part of the product presentation that this team developed, of which I was the only outside member, was to look at long-term product of evolution of the processor. And so we actually created a trajectory and put products out here that most companies don't want to do. They don't want to say what their future is going to be, because then they're somehow committed to that in the marketplace. And if they don't execute on that, then they're a failure. I mean, they will really get dinged big, and particularly in the financial markets. And so, but that was where you had to go to tell people that if they standardized on the Intel processor, that their products would basically see a path to constantly evolving with the same basic operating system, and that you didn't have to redo your product every 3 to 4 years. And Motorola had a leadership role, and I had a couple experiences with Motorola. One was over the StarTech phone, which they invited me to give a presentation to their management on what I thought would help brand that phone. That was the way they put it. And they pit me against a team from Procter & Gamble who were the Tide team, Tide soap. And so each of us made this presentation in front of Chris Galvin, who was the president, and his staff. And I basically told him that StarTech was going to become, a cheap product, and it was going to be copied by people in Southeast Asia, and it was going to end up being $1. And that they had to put value added into the product through software and enhancements, and really kind of move downstream with it, and creating more and more functionality in it. And it was an analog phone, but it cost $2,500. And so, in any event, they weren't happy with that answer, that they had to go back to work. They liked the Procter & Gamble answer, which Procter & Gamble was at the time spending $2 billion a year on advertising for Tide. And that team presented that kind of, and that's where they liked that answer better than mine. And in any event, shortly thereafter, I was in Akihabara, and the Electronics Center in Tokyo. And I was walking down the street, and there was literally a wicker basket piled high with phones. They were $1 a piece, 100 yen at the time, and this was out of the Tokyo. What was the name of the Tokyo phone company that came out with this phone? It was very popular in Japan, and you could make phone calls, but you could also send text messages, and you could do certain things with it that you couldn't do with your normal phone. And they were sold for $1, but they were sold on the basis of subscription. So you bought one and you paid something like $30 a month to use it. So the value of the hardware was nothing, but it was the services that you sold through the phone that had value, which is eventually what the iPhone and all the others had. And I bought 7 of those, one for each of my grandkids.
For $7?
Yeah, for $7. And I brought them back, gave them to my grandkids as they were all little. They could play with it. It lit up. Couldn't do anything with it, but they at least, it was $1, and it was much cheaper than actually one you could get at Toys R Us, a plastic one. And then also just working with Motorola, I went up and I told you later, Spindler had written a letter to the president of Motorola Semiconductor telling him that they should hire us to help them broaden the scope of usage of the 68,000 into more popular platforms, and the follow-on devices, but Motorola saw the 68,000 as another chip. They really didn't see it as, I think, as important as it was, as a system where Intel began hiring people from Dave House, for example. Dave House came out of a systems house. He was one of the key people who helped, and Bill David came out of a computer systems house. So these people started thinking not in terms of selling chips, but of selling systems on a chip that had the same characteristics as if you were putting in a long-term system. But the people at Motorola, they basically, I had a meeting with them. I spent all day there. And I remember one of the key product guys said to me, "Tell me again why we should be thinking about software." And of course, the whole business of the microprocessor is understanding software. And I had failed that whole day in having a conversation with him. But I did learn from the CEO of that group that he said, I told him about how the Crush product was put together. This was after we were done work with Intel. I told him that it took 1 week for us to spend off-site working on the strategy. The following week, we presented it to the executive staff. They approved it on, I think it was Monday. The end of that week, we brought teams from all over the world to Intel, brought them to one of the, I think, Ricky's Hyatt House, and we started assigning responsibilities for all different, from the product to distribution to sales to training to developing presentations, technical presentations, to everything. I mean, it was a really far-reaching scoped plan and project, and I said, and it was executed within 1 month. He said it would take me that long to get a ticket, approval to get a ticket to fly back to Chicago to meet with the top management people to get okay. And he said, so you began just from internally to hear about the hierarchy of the company. And whereas at Intel, the person who was driving this was the CEO, Andy Grove. And so it was this difference again between these sort of Eastern companies that are highly structured with organizational flows and so forth that never really made decisions quickly. And whereas at Intel, it was, they were pretty much a model company back in those days, I think. And most people that came out of there will absolutely agree with that. It was the greatest learning experience of their life. There was IBM and DEC. Working with IBM, and we did have a very good business with IBM, helping them with their mini computers, moving them into business segments. And I knew Jack Keeler, who at the time was president of IBM. Jack was the only engineer to ever be a president of IBM. He went to Santa Clara University, and he sat on the Santa Clara board with me. And so I got to know Jack very well, and he brought me back to headquarters in New York and introduced me to people. And he said, and I had written a book called Who's Afraid of Big Blue, and he had read it, and He says, my goal is to change your mind on IBM. And so we became very close friends. And so I got to know a little bit about it and trying to change it and how to really implement it. So we worked with him on that one, and then we worked on the application server business. So it was a number of projects at IBM that we worked on in helping them get into businesses. And they worked well. But the key thing about IBM is that they knew who their customers were. They knew who their market was. DEC was the backroom engineering computer. It worked in engineering departments. It worked in manufacturing. That's where the DEC computers were really strong in the marketplace. And we had done some research at IBM, and we did some research at DEC, and found that DEC wanted to move into the accounting and into the front office and compete with IBM. And in fact, they were on the cover of Fortune. They were on the cover as being overtaking IBM at one point. This was probably in the early 90s. And but that was more of the media making that decision and DEC wanting to do that, but certainly not from the customer standpoint, because they just didn't have the knowledge or the tools to do that. And so when they took IBM in on that place, they really began to lose market share or momentum. And IBM certainly won that. DEC ended up being, and they didn't adopt the PC, whereas IBM went off and created a PC, so they began understanding the power of the Moore's Law that was coming upstream, whereas they were trying to push downstream. And so I was invited to a strategy session back at DEC by Ken Olson and spent a couple days back there with him and his team. And they thought the microcomputer was a toy, would have no impact whatsoever because it just didn't have the capability of creating the input and output and the bandwidths that were necessary for high-speed connection, not anticipating the internet.
When you're, I just want to interject here, when you were at a strategy session like that, let's say just take the DEC strategy session for a minute, was your role in that instance to say to them, actually, you know, I'm working with a lot of companies in this area who are taking the opposite view, and to present that to them and help open their minds a little bit that might actually not be the case?
I never went into these meetings not prepared by research or by tangible evidence, you know, because a lot of it was, what do you know, you're a marketing guy. And I learned that from Intel and Andy Grove too. And so I always went in, you know, with customer viewpoints that I had built my own network of people out there in the marketplace at GE, at you know, various systems houses that I got to know, various analysts and so forth. And like everything else, I took a lot of notes, and then I would put those into slides, and I would present them at meetings before, rather than say it's my viewpoint. I would say, here's a feedback from either, you know, some analysts or from customers. And there was one key guy who ran the microelectronics lab at GE that I got to know really well. I knew Max Hopper, who was sort of the CIO's CIO. He built the whole system for Bank of America, their computer systems. He built, he did the Federal Express and American Airlines, rather, their whole reservation system. So he became known as sort of the CIO's CIO, and was a really revered person in the industry, and a wonderful person, and I got to know him well, and he became a client. And so those kind of people I would keep in touch with, and they always gave me a lot of good feedback. So when I went into, Olson asked me to give a presentation to his executive staff and to his board. And there wasn't the whole board, but there was a number of people from the board that were in the meeting. And so I was doing this. This was the time it was foils and overheads. And there was, and so I was talking about this, and it was pretty simple stuff. It was staying close to your customers so you can gain feedback on what's going on out there and where they're moving and how they're thinking, and then adapting your business to it. And there was a fellow who I think he was head of sales, whose body language was sort of sitting there scowling and sitting back and didn't like the fact that I was even there. And about halfway through, he interrupted me and he said, I was saying about, keeping in touch with your customers, and he said to me, we do all that. And I said, you do? I said, yeah. I said, so how do you know what your customer? He says, we do a survey. And I said, how often do you? He said, once a year. And I said, okay. I said, do you think that's often enough? Do you think that feedback's often enough? And he said, yes. And I said, he said, but we talk to our customers. And so I had a slide. And the slide was from the CIO of Citibank, New York. And it was, then it was the largest bank in the United States. And I put it up, and the quote was, if you're doing this survey for DEC, would you please have someone from DEC call on me? I haven't seen anybody in a year. And now this was the sort of prototype company where where they had a lot of computers installed. And so Ken Olson just got furious in the meeting. I mean, he went over and grabbed the guy and was just upset. But I knew I had just slit my own throat, because things at DEC and work from the bottom up. They don't work from the top down all the time, particularly in marketing. So while Ken said he wanted to work with us long term, no one in the company after that would work with us. So it sort of slit my own throat, but it made a point. Yeah. But they didn't learn from that, because, quite frankly, I think if they'd have gone to these businesses, they would have seen the rise of these small computers, on everybody's desktop, and not rejected them. But Tandem did too. The CEO at Tandem told me that those things were nothing but toys and games. And I remember sitting in his office. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. I went over to have a meeting with him, and he drew it on the board. They just don't have the power and the memory and the networking capability and all that sort of stuff, the bandwidth. And but yet they had no knowledge of Moore's law, and so there was a lot of resistance to getting this into companies, because the major computer companies just didn't see it happening. Another one other company, and we'll go on, but was Silicon Graphics. I mean, people don't realize Silicon Graphics was like a $8 to $10 billion company at one point, when Apple was probably $1 or $2 billion, and they really had a chance because they had this graphics engine that it was really a powerful technology. It was what they were founded on, and what they built most of their businesses on, these graphic workstations. They're, again, I'm not going to get into names, but their CEO and I, we had a meeting, and he told me that IBM had offered to put their graphics engine card into every PC. And what did I think? And I said, it'd make you a worldwide standard overnight, to do that, and it would really, set your business going. They turned it down. They turned it down because they felt they could do it themselves, create, build their own computer and their own systems. And so they passed up being the sort of standard graphics engine in the PC business, which ended up being billions of computers out there.
That's right.
And then also they when Apple was during that Gil Amelio days and Spindler and Gil Amelio days, when everybody was talking about Apple declining, I felt that the only one in the Valley that had an opportunity to replace Apple would have been Silicon Graphics. They had Apple, after all, the Mac was a graphics engine. It's made its debut on the basis that it could do graphics and other types of besides just text and so forth. And that the silicon graphics workstation could be reduced in cost to the state that it could compete, or that they could develop their own personal computer along that lines. And so I met with the president and whom I knew and was meeting with, and they had been our client early on, but not during this period, and suggested that to him, and he said, well, we're already doing it. And I said, oh, yeah. He said, yeah, we have 100 people working on it. And I said, wow. He said, I'll show you when we go back. So we went back after lunch, and he introduced me to the people. And again, he thought my background in personal computers could help them, but they didn't. And so there was, again, this hubris. We know our way. We know what we're doing. And, of course, they did come out with a box. It was, I think it was $10,000. It was, you know, huge. It was not a personal computer. It was a computer, but it wasn't anything like that would replace, you know, selling like a you know, the Apple Mac or the Apple II. And so there was a lot of hubris in the company of we know what we're doing. I even had a presentation to them at one time in which I was pushing the idea of beta sites and learning from beta sites as to how you adapt your product to the market. And they said that the customer can't tell them anything that they don't already know. I was absolutely given that feedback from the engineers. We know what the technology can do. They don't. And so there was not a willingness, I think, to listen to what was going on in the world around them, nor to, you know, sort of heed advice. I mean, that was a very common kind of thing. Yeah, you know, if you look at, I could actually go on and on because I have a long list of these kind of, because I've worked personally with hundreds of companies over 30 years, and so there's probably not two competitors that I haven't worked with.
Well, I think this is a very useful part of this whole whole oral history process, because especially because the museum's Exponential Center wants to record some of these insights. These are exactly the kinds of lessons they want to try to distill out, I think, into
well, there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of those kind of lessons if you were to combine different oral histories. And you know, I've started doing that as well. I mean, it's how I found a lot of things out, is just by going and searching the oral histories, and then getting the details. I mean, I can give you and I'm not saying mine is right. It's just that at the time that was the conversation that I had, and maybe they thought I was arrogant and so forth. But I was simply making comparisons with what I knew and what I didn't know. I wasn't trying to take over the company, and I wasn't trying to be an engineer.
If you were to distill, and you've done this throughout your career, if you were to distill those types of comparisons into a principle or two or three about why some companies succeed in that technology environment and why some don't, what would you say they are?
I'll first answer it by saying that failure doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, you're not going to succeed. And I learned that from Noyce, because I was on a plane with Bob Noyce, and I was mentioning that 2/3 of the companies in Silicon Valley fail. I just read a report out of one of the universities, a study. This was back in, actually I think it was in the 70s, maybe the early 80s. And Bob said, maybe not enough fail. And I was kind of taken back by it, and I said, well, so what do you mean? He says, well, when you fail, it means you're trying new things. Often means you're trying new things. So he said, that's the nature of it. You learn by doing, and you fail at times, but you don't let that overwhelm you or overcome you. So you sort of move forward beyond that. And so the lessons that I learned, well, that was number one. Number two is that it's so much is based on the financial aspects of a company, because you can only move forward if you have the money in the bank, or you have the resources to apply to the next solution, or to give time to the marketplace to move to that next solution. An answer to that might have been even Next, who had to sell because they really had built this hardware around a really beautiful operating system, but they didn't have the commitment of their backers to move to that next financing. And I know that because I knew the people at Canon who were part of the finance deal at Apple, and I had conversations with the president who kept asking me what I thought about what's happened with Next and how they were going to get their money back, because I had an office in Tokyo, and so I got to know him. So it's those kind of perspectives that you have to learn. So financial resources become very important. I'm on the board of a company called Nanosys, which is a nanotechnology company, and it's now going on 15 years I've been on the board. But it's a basic materials company. It's hard to develop, and at first nano was going to be everything. It was going from biotech to aerospace to communications to, whatever. And it was only within the last 7-8 years that they focused on a particular product, which was displays, and how to enhance the color output of a display. And then Samsung has built all their new televisions around it, the color televisions. And the reason they could survive that long is because they raised initially something like 80 million at a time when nanotech was the hot subject. And so they were able to use that 80 million and not necessarily they blew a lot of it, but they blew it on the wrong technologies, trying things that didn't work, and then eventually got the management team that was able to pull it off. But it was the initial funding that really allowed them to sustain themselves. And so I think that's a real key principle. The second one is this competitive analysis, and it's not just competitive, it's understanding where your core technology is evolving and how it's evolving. We've lived here in the Valley understanding Moore's Law, or innately understanding Moore's Law. I think Steve understood it really well. He knew things were going to get smaller, better, faster, cheaper. How you implement that depends upon an awful lot of technologies moving simultaneously. It's not just what you do, it's what all of the ancillary, because you buy, and Apple buys a lot of its electronics and its software from other people. It even acquires those companies. So having a broad perspective about where you're moving and who are the surrounding resources that you need to follow in order to bring that to the next new generation. I don't expect the technology is going to slow down for anybody. So you have to have these, as somebody said, the way you work in a the way you work in a real-time world is you're constantly gathering data so you can make rapid decisions. So you have to constantly be out there with a lot of sensors in the ground, getting feedback all the time. And the technology allows you to do that, but it's it's not really personalized in the sense of, okay, is that something that we should or shouldn't do? So there's ultimately the human judgment. So you need seasoned management. And I think that's one of the problems that we've seen recently in companies here in Silicon Valley. The management just aren't seasoned. They haven't gone through a lot of both either technological or even social change themselves. I think probably the best example of that is Facebook. These are very young people with not a lot of personal experience in the marketplace or seasons and experience to have dealt with these kind of broad social issues that their product has become. And that's the challenge there. It's not that the technology is given to them. How they use that it takes some really thought about how society adapts to technologies, how we learn to use technologies, and the addictive nature of it. And so, we've been addicted to technology for a long time. I mean, the handheld remote control was there long before Facebook, and yet people were addicted to it. I mean, switching channel has become sort of a family joke. And so there are things, when this is in the hands of people, they start using it. And there's enough things out there showing that, how people hold on to these things and use them, and they become read Marshall McLuhan. I mean, and Marshall McLuhan said this, 50 years ago, that these technologies are extensions of ourselves, and we personalize them to the extent that we don't identify them outside of ourselves. And so there are maybe more philosophical issues that they're faced with that seasoned management just don't have the experience of dealing with, or even young management today. So the understanding that environment, I think, becomes really, really critical. And then there's the government involvement. The government is cutting back on science. And science, it's quite true that the Silicon Valley was really started with, government investment, military investment, and there still have been a large investment from various government agencies and so forth in technology. And there's a group that I was a member of for a long time at Harvard called the Use of Dual Technologies, and that is technologies that are developed for military but have a dual purpose into the consumer world. And that's really where, say, the microprocessor or even the memory or graphics engines or lasers or whatever, all of these technologies have been adapted for both. And you can use a laser to, shoot down a plane, but you can also use a laser to scan for eye disease. You can use a laser to get your supermarket checkouts done swiftly. So these have wide kinds of applications in all areas. And understanding that is important. And I read that Tim Cook is spending more time in Washington now on trade, and so these trade restrictions because the technology business. All the technology businesses are global, and we rely on because they are global, they're competitively global. And that's where, we're going to see huge challenges and people move ahead. I'll give you an example of this that I personally experienced. I was on the board of a company called Hanna. Hanna was a biotech company that was cloning the islets of Langerhans, which grow insulin. And so they were growing insulin in a Petri dish. And there's a lot of different processes that they had to do. They had to encapsulate the cells to protect them from antibodies and so forth. And probably for 5 years they developed this technology and were working on it. This was during the Reagan administration, and they because it was said that you would clone life and clone other kinds of things out of this, that was looked at as a government frowned on doing that, and so they stopped commitment to any of these kind of developments or funding any of these kind of developments. And the financial community therefore said, hey, we're not going to commit to you anymore because we're not going to be able to develop that kind of technology here in the United States. And so all that technology went overseas. And so the government had a direct influence in shutting down a startup.
And driving it all offshore.
And driving it offshore. And they are driving it offshore.
You certainly talked about, I want to go back for a minute to the points you were making about wisdom and seasoning and leadership of a company. You've given some examples of instances where you offered a well-researched, well-rounded opinion about strategic choices a company could make based on your experience and also the data you brought in that weren't accepted. Who do you think was able, as a client or relationship of yours, who was able to take the best advantage of the kind of completely well-rounded 360-degree thinking that you brought in at various points in your company?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of those companies, a lot of smaller companies, because I get feedback from them for times that people who either work for us or who will tell me that, you know, I gave a talk at their company and so forth. I still get lots of those kind of fan mail, if you will. But I think that probably the one up, and I can only vouch for them up until, you know, probably the late 90s was Intel. I think and that was driven through their product marketing department. I think product marketing is, if that team is solid within a company, they really do an outstanding job, because their job is to have a handle on what's going on outside and what's going on inside, and bring those two together. And if you have a really mature product marketing group, they do that. And I can't tell you the number of companies that I've recommended. I just did that recently. Somebody called me and asked me. I had lunch with them, and they said, you know, we've been debating. They got rid of their marketing person and said, do we need a marketing manager? And I said, no, you need more product marketing managers. You know, people who can engage you with the outside world, but also have a chance of understanding your product well enough to be able to connect the two. And I think that's that Intel. I think Apple certainly from the beginning, but that wasn't just me. I think that was a combination of the teams that we put to work on Apple, and again, a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about were part of training sessions at our company. We had a lot of training sessions, and we had the building over there on Embarcadero that had a huge, actually it was a huge sort of hall or center, open room, but it had cameras all around that could, and then we had a camera booth, so we could record all kinds of training sessions and then replay them. There are offices around the world. And so we had people, you know, we had our clients come in and give presentations from the earliest days. I would have people from, you know, when there was quality problems, I had 2 or 3 different quality control managers come in and talk to our people about Intel and what they're doing in that area, or another company. So we had our clients, I would ask our clients, key people, to come in and talk about what they're doing to our group. We had an international marketing committee that had people from Europe. We had the head of R&D at Sony, Dave House, was on that committee, and we had regular meetings that discussed marketing in the technology realm around the world. And we recorded those sessions. I have some of those recordings. So it was all of these kinds of things that broke down. So the teams that went to work at Apple, the teams that went to work at Intel, you know, I wasn't doing this work as much as trying to figure out ways to get it out through multiple sources, and writing the books and giving lectures on that and so forth. And the books were a succession of ideas that grew and changed over time. And
you were running a real learning organization.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, one of the recent presidents of SRI said to me, I gave a talk, and he said, it's the first time I ever heard of marketing as an education process. And he said, you ought to do something on that. I said, I've been doing something on that for 50 years.
For 50 years, yeah, yeah.